Everyone knows how Saul died. He lost his final battle, his sons were killed beside him, and rather than be captured, he fell on his own sword. A soldier's ending, grim but simple, the kind of death that closes a chapter without asking you to think too hard about it. What almost nobody talks about is what he did the night before. He put on a disguise, he waited for dark, he slipped past enemy lines with 2 of his own men, walked for hours through territory that belonged, that night, to the army about to kill him, and knocked on the door of a woman he'd never met to ask her to do one specific thing: bring a dead man back long enough to talk to him. And, according to the text, it worked. This is one of the strangest scenes in the entire Old Testament, and it's strange for reasons that go well past the Bible has a ghost story in it. The king asking for this had personally outlawed the exact practice he was about to use. He'd hunted down and expelled people who did exactly what he was now traveling all night to find. The word for what he was doing shares its root with almost nothing else in the text, except, as it turns out, his own name, which had been quietly explaining his entire story since before he was ever crowned. And the message he got that night wasn't new information. It was something he'd already been told, years earlier, by the very same man he was now digging up out of the ground. Let's go to that night and to everything sitting underneath it.
Start with what Saul is actually risking by making this trip, because the danger is layered 3 different ways, and most retellings only notice one of them. First, legally. 1 Samuel 28:3 tells you, almost in passing, that Saul himself had put the mediums and necromancers out of the land. This isn't background law he inherited and quietly ignored. This is Saul's own policy, enforced under his own reign, in line with Deuteronomy 18:10-12 and Leviticus 20:6 and 27, a category of practice the Torah treats as serious enough to warrant death. The king, now walking toward Endor, is about to personally commit the exact crime he spent years hunting down and punishing in other people. Second, geographically. The Philistines had camped at Shunem. Saul had camped opposite them at Gilboa, the 2 armies close enough to see each other's watchfires across the valley of Jezreel at night. Endor sat only a handful of miles north of both camps, near the hill of Moreh, which meant getting there required moving through territory that was, for all practical purposes, enemy-controlled ground that night. Saul doesn't send a servant to handle this quietly. He goes himself, in disguise, with 2 companions, on foot, in the dark, slipping past the army that's going to face him in battle the next morning. Third, spiritually, and this is the one that takes a little longer to unpack because it's the one most retellings skip past fastest to get to the ghost. Samuel is already dead by this point in the story. Israel had mourned him and buried him at Ramah. That door, the ordinary, sanctioned way Saul used to get direct answers from God through a living prophet standing in front of him, is already permanently closed. And the text tells you plainly in verse 6 that Saul tried the legitimate channels first, and tried all of them. He inquired of the Lord and got nothing back. No dreams in the night, no answer through the Urim, the priestly instrument used for yes or no verdicts from God, no word delivered through any prophet. Silence, tested and confirmed across every single method Israel had for hearing from God. That's the condition Saul is standing in when he finally turns to his own servants and asks them to find him a medium, not a sudden reckless whim, a last resort reached only after every legitimate door had already been quietly, thoroughly shut.
Here's what's actually sitting inside this story, concretely. There's a real Hebrew word for what the woman at Endor does, of. And understanding what that word is actually describing changes how you read the whole encounter, including a detail about who reacts to it first and how. And there's something buried in a name that's been sitting in plain sight since chapter 1 of this book, attached to Saul before he was ever crowned. His own name is built on the Hebrew verb for asking. Israel asked for a king. They got Saul. And on the last night of his life, the man whose entire identity is quite literally the one who was asked for, goes looking for an answer after his own asking has finally gone silent. A forbidden word and a name that's been quietly explaining this whole story since before it started. Let's build both, and then watch what happens when they collide in one room at night in enemy territory. Go back to where Saul's name comes from, because it isn't incidental and it isn't a stretch. It's sitting in the Hebrew text plainly enough that Strong's own concordance lists it. Sha'ul, entry 7586, asked for. 1 Samuel 8 records Israel demanding a king. Give us a king to judge us, they say, and the verb underneath that demand is sha'al, to ask, to request, to petition for something you don't currently have. God grants it, reluctantly, through Samuel, and when the text later reflects on how Saul came to the throne, 1 Samuel 12:13 makes the connection explicit and impossible to miss. You have asked for a king, and the Lord has set a king over you. Sha'ul, Saul, is in Hebrew essentially the passive form of that same verb. It means asked for, the one requested. His entire existence as king is the answer to a national act of asking. There's a curious, honestly debated footnote worth mentioning here. A chapter earlier, in 1 Samuel 1:20, Hannah names her own son, Samuel, not Saul, and explains the name using this same root, sha'al, because I have asked for him from the Lord. Scholars have long noted that this explanation fits the name Saul more precisely than it fits Samuel, whose name more naturally derives from a different root meaning heard or name of God. Some read this as simple wordplay stretching across both names. Others suggest it's the text quietly tying the two men's destinies together from the very first chapter, the boy named for hearing and the king named for asking, both bound up in the same verb before either of their stories has really begun. Whichever reading you land on, the through line into chapter 28 is unmistakable. Saul inquires of the Lord there, same root, sha'al, one more time, and gets nothing back. The man built out of a nation's asking is the one person in Israel who can't get an answer to his own.
Now the word for what he does next. The woman at Endor is called in the Hebrew a balat ov, literally mistress of the ov. Scholars don't fully agree what ov meant at its root. Some tie it to a ritual pit used for summoning spirits up from below, others to a hollow, muffled quality of sound, a kind of controlled mumbling meant to sound like a dead voice speaking through a living throat, closer to ventriloquism than to what modern readers picture when they hear witch. What's consistent across the readings is the idea of channeling, making contact with the dead and letting them, or something claiming to be them, speak through you. That's the practice Saul had personally banned. That's the practice he's now traveling through enemy territory, in disguise, at night, to access, because the sanctioned way of asking had gone quiet, and he wasn't willing to let the silence stand as the answer. Now the scene itself, and it doesn't go the way most retellings imply. Saul arrives, disguised, in the dark, and asks the woman to bring up whoever he names. She's cautious at first. She knows the law as well as he does, and she assumes, reasonably, that this could be a trap set by the king himself to catch her practicing the very thing he'd outlawed. Saul swears an oath, in the name of the Lord no less, that no harm will come to her for it. A striking thing for the man who banned this practice to be swearing on God's own name in order to access it. He tells her, "Bring up Samuel." And then, verse 12, something happens that the text treats almost matter-of-factly, but that should stop you cold if you're paying attention.
It's not Saul who reacts first, it's the woman. She sees something and she cries out in a loud voice, and immediately she knows this is Saul. Whatever she was expecting to produce that night, whatever her usual practice looked like, this wasn't it. She's startled by her own ritual working.
Saul, still not seeing anything himself yet, asks her what she sees. She describes a godlike figure coming up out of the earth, an old man wrapped in a robe, and Saul, finally recognizing the description, bows his face to the ground. Then the voice speaks, irritated, if anything, at being disturbed. "Why have you disturbed me, bringing me up?" And here's the detail that changes the whole scene. What follows isn't new information. Verses 17 and 18 have Samuel deliver almost the exact judgment Saul had already heard, word for word, back in chapter 15. "The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord." That's not a fresh revelation dredged up from beyond the grave. That's a callback, repeated almost verbatim. Saul already knew this. He'd known it for years, ever since the day he stood in front of a living Samuel and heard the same sentence for the first time. He didn't travel through enemy lines on the eve of battle to learn something new. He went to hear, one more time, whether the answer might somehow have changed since then. It hadn't. And the voice adds one final line before it's finished. "Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." Whatever comfort or terror sits inside that phrase, and the text doesn't tell you which to feel, it's the last thing Saul hears before walking back out into the dark. That repeated line isn't a coincidence. It's the text pointing you back on purpose, forcing you to sit in the same moment twice. 1 Samuel 15 is the Amalek episode. Saul is told to devote everything to destruction, spares the best of the plunder and the enemy king against the explicit command, and Samuel delivers the verdict in 15:28. The kingdom has been torn from him that very day, given to a neighbor better than he is. That's years before Endor. That's the original moment the door closed, spoken by a living prophet standing face to face with a living king. Everything that happens at Endor, all of it, the disguise, the night travel, the risk of enemy territory, the crime he'd banned, is Saul knocking on a door he already knows is shut, hoping the second knock produces a different answer than the first one did. Compare that to the very first asking in this book, which sets the whole pattern in motion before Saul even exists in the story. 1 Samuel 1. Hannah, childless, weeping and praying with such raw intensity in the temple that the priest Eli assumes she's drunk, asks God for a son, and the son she's given becomes Samuel, the prophet whose very name the text ties to that act of asking. Hannah's asking is answered, gratefully, publicly, and it produces a life devoted entirely to hearing God clearly and passing that word on to others. Saul's asking, a generation later, produces the exact opposite arc, a king who keeps asking and keeps not hearing until the silence becomes unbearable enough that he breaks his own law trying to force an answer out of it by force. And the book doesn't leave you to work out the moral on your own, decades removed from the scene. 1 Chronicles 10, 13, and 14, written centuries later, looking back on this exact night with the clarity of hindsight, stated plainly, "Saul died for his unfaithfulness, because he did not keep the word of the Lord, and even consulted a medium, seeking guidance, and did not inquire of the Lord." The chronicler isn't guessing at Saul's inner motives from a distance. He's naming the crime in a single sentence and putting the medium and the missing inquiry side by side on purpose. So what actually happened at Endor? This is where honesty requires slowing down, because the text does not make this easy, and neither should we.
One reading holds that God, in a unique and sovereign exception, permitted the actual spirit of Samuel to appear, not because necromancy works, not because the woman's craft had any real power of its own, but because this one night, for this one purpose, God chose to let it happen anyway. The medium's own shock supports this reading. She wasn't expecting her ritual to actually produce anything, which is exactly why she's the one who cries out in surprise, not Saul. Something happened that broke her own expectations of what her practice could do.
A second reading holds that what appeared wasn't Samuel at all, a deceiving spirit taking his shape and voice, delivering a message true enough to be devastating, precisely because true words dressed as prophecy are the most effective lie a deceiver could possibly tell a desperate king. This reading leans on passages like Ecclesiastes 9:5, which says plainly that the dead know nothing, and Isaiah 8:19, which mocks the very idea of consulting the dead on behalf of the living. Why seek the living among the dead, the prophet asks, as if the answer should be obvious. The text itself doesn't referee this dispute for you, and it's worth noticing that it doesn't even try. It describes the woman seeing something, describes Saul recognizing it and reacting as though it's genuinely Samuel, and moves on to the message itself without a narrator's footnote explaining the metaphysics underneath the scene. That's not an accident of ancient storytelling, and it's not the text being careless. It's consistent with how honestly this book handles hard scenes everywhere else. It hands you the event and lets the weight of it sit unresolved, the same way it refuses to smooth over Saul's own contradictions instead of explaining them away. What isn't in dispute, whichever reading you land on, is what the message did to Saul in that room. And what isn't in dispute is that he'd already been told this once earlier by a living man and went looking for it a second time anyway, through a door he himself had nailed shut. The scene doesn't end with the verdict. It ends unexpectedly with a meal. Saul collapses, full length on the ground, verse 20 says, filled with fear and with no strength left in him at all, because he hadn't eaten anything the entire day and night leading up to this. And the woman, the same medium he'd threatened with an oath just minutes earlier, the same woman who has every reason to want this dangerous stranger out of her house as quickly as possible, looks at the king lying broken on her floor and does something almost tender instead. She has a fattened calf in the house. She kills it, bakes bread without yeast because there's no time left to let it rise properly, and urges him, along with his 2 men, to eat something before they go. He refuses at first, too shaken to want food. She insists. He eats. It's a strange, quiet, deeply human moment to find at the bottom of a story about forbidden magic and a king's last night alive. A stranger, of all people, feeding a doomed man his final meal, because whatever else is true about her and her banned practice, she doesn't want him to walk back out that door and collapse from hunger before he even reaches the battlefield he isn't going to survive. Picture a lamp burning down through its last hour of oil. It doesn't go out all at once. It flickers, gutters, flares back up briefly, and only then finally fails. That's the shape of Saul's whole night at Endor. One last flare of asking before the light goes out for good. A king named from birth for asking. A silence where an answer used to come easily, through dreams, through the Urim, through prophets standing in front of him, a door already closed years earlier, at a different moment of disobedience, by a verdict spoken once and never revoked. A forbidden path taken not to learn something new, but to hear an old sentence repeated one more time, hoping against everything he already knew that it might somehow have changed. It hadn't. And then, almost as an afterthought, tacked on to the end of the most theologically loaded scene in his story, a meal offered by the one person that night with no remaining reason to be kind to him at all.
If you've ever kept praying the same prayer long after the answer had already come, just not the one you wanted to hear, this is that experience, pushed to its most extreme and most literal conclusion. Saul wasn't punished at Endor for asking. Asking was never the problem, and it never had been, going all the way back to his own name. He was punished, the text suggests, for refusing to accept the answer he'd already been given once, and for reaching for a forbidden shortcut instead of sitting in the silence a little longer. The tragedy at the center of this story isn't that God stopped speaking to Saul. It's what Saul was willing to do and how far he was willing to travel in the dark rather than let the silence stand as the answer it already was. If a story this strange has been sitting in your Bible the whole time and nobody ever walked you through what the words underneath it are actually doing, that's exactly what this channel exists for. Subscribe if you want the next one. Comment whether you land on the real Samuel reading or the deceiving spirit reading, and share this with someone who thinks they already know how Saul's story ends. Thank you for being here. God bless you.